I built an empire worth billions by seeing people as chess pieces. Emotions were liabilities, until I met her. One deal changed everything. My calculated heart wasn't supposed to feel anything, but for the first time in my life, I was the one being played. I remember standing on the balcony of my penthouse, 47 floors above the city that had become my chessboard. From up here, everyone looked small, exactly how I preferred to see them. The Forbes article called me ruthlessly brilliant last month. The Wall Street Journal profile mentioned my Midas touch. 23 companies acquired in 5 years, each one turning to gold in my portfolio. 8 billion in assets. 3,000 employees who feared my name. One man at the top, alone. That was the secret, staying alone. When you're building an empire, there's no room for distraction. I had the formula down to perfection. Identify weakness, exploit opportunity, accumulate power. Repeat. My executive team called it the machine, the decision-making process that turned failing companies into profit engines. But what they didn't understand was that the real machine was me. I had engineered myself to function without the bugs in the human system: compassion, attachment, doubt. Emotions are inefficiencies. That's what my father taught me before he lost everything to a business partner he considered family. I watched him crumble, a cautionary tale I vowed never to become. So I built walls higher than my skyscrapers, created distance wider than my global reach. In boardrooms, they'd whisper that I couldn't possibly have a heart. They were right. I had a calculator instead. My morning routine was a testament to precision. 4:30 a.m. workout, markets review by 5:45, 3 acquisition proposals evaluated before 7. No time wasted on relationships that didn't serve the bottom line. Dating was a quarterly event, strategic appearances with impressive companions who understood our arrangement was temporary. Family gatherings were scheduled annually, treated like low-priority meetings. The system works, I told myself each night, looking out at the city lights, the empire that validated my approach. The evidence was in the numbers, in the fear-tinged respect in people's eyes, in the growing fortress of wealth that protected me from ever becoming like my father. What I couldn't have calculated was her, the variable that would corrupt my flawless equation. It was supposed to be just another deal, the kind I'd done dozens of times before. Her company was innovative but struggling, ripe for acquisition. The meeting was set for 30 minutes. I expected nothing more than another business transaction, another piece added to my growing monopoly. How was I supposed to know that this particular chess piece would change the game entirely? Before I tell you how my perfect system collapsed, how the machine I'd built broke down in spectacular fashion, I want you to understand something. This isn't a story about business strategy. It's about the moment when the walls I'd constructed to keep weakness out became the very thing trapping me inside. If you've ever built something so perfect that it became your prison, if you've ever wondered what happens when success feels empty, then hit subscribe. Follow my journey from ruthless billionaire to someone who discovered what really matters when everything he built was suddenly at stake. Sometimes the heart you denied for so long finds a way to betray you. And sometimes that betrayal is exactly what you needed all along. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. That's the first thing you should know. The penthouse, the jets, the empire. I built it all from scratch with nothing but raw determination and an absolute refusal to fail. My first office was a corner table at a 24-hour diner where the waitress would refill my coffee cup out of pity. I spent 18 hours a day there, cold calling investors, running numbers, drafting business plans. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. When people talk about sacrifice for success, they usually mean skipping parties or working weekends. They don't talk about the deeper cuts. I missed my mother's funeral because I was closing my first major deal. The investors wouldn't reschedule, and I made my choice. That night, after signing the papers, I didn't celebrate. I stood alone in that empty diner and felt something harden inside me. The first brick in the wall I'd spent years constructing. My first company was a tech startup that streamlined supply chains. Nothing sexy, nothing revolutionary, just brutally efficient. I hired people smarter than me in specific domains, extracted their brilliance, and discarded them when they wanted more than I was willing to give. Friendship, loyalty, work-life balance. These were concepts for smaller minds with smaller ambitions. By 30, I had acquired 3 competitors and eliminated thousands of redundant positions. The business press called me ruthless. I called it necessary. Every relationship in my life had a purpose, a clear ROI. My assistant knew more about me than anyone alive, not because we were close, but because efficiency demanded it. My therapist received carefully curated versions of my thoughts, just enough to keep the mental machinery running smoothly. Even my few friends were strategic alliances, people with connections, influence, or knowledge I might someday need. The loneliness? I rebranded it as focus. The emptiness at 2 a.m. when the work was done? I filled it with more work. There was always another deal, another acquisition, another competitor to crush. The game never ended, and that was the point. Stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant weakness. I remember the night I crossed the billion-dollar threshold. No champagne, no celebration. I simply sat in my office, stared at the number on the screen, and felt nothing. Just a momentary satisfaction quickly replaced by hunger for the next target. That's when I realized money had never been the goal. It was the scoreboard, not the game. The real addiction was to the power, the strategy, the perfect execution of plans where humans were just assets and liabilities on a spreadsheet. My reputation preceded me everywhere. Board members would physically tense when I entered rooms. CEOs of companies I targeted would make desperate moves to avoid my attention. The liquidator, they called me in industry circles, the man who could dismantle decades of business history with a few signatures, extract the value, and discard the remains. Then came the Morrison deal, the biggest acquisition target of my career. A family-owned conglomerate with tentacles in everything from real estate to renewable energy. Old money, old values, built over generations. The kind of empire that considered itself untouchable. Their financials told a different story. Over-leveraged, mismanaged by the founder's grandchildren, ripe for dismantling. The potential return was staggering. Breaking it into pieces and selling them individually would triple my net worth. What I didn't know was that meeting Sarah Morrison would be the first domino in the collapse of everything I'd built. Not just my business strategy, but the carefully constructed machinery of my existence. The perfect system that had insulated me from the messiness of human connection for so long. She wasn't supposed to be in that meeting. The Morrison family had sent lawyers and executives to negotiate the terms of surrender. But there she was, the youngest granddaughter, the one person in the family who still believed their crumbling empire could be saved. I expected tears, emotional appeals, desperate negotiations. What I got instead was someone who spoke my language. Cold, hard data, and unflinching determination. Someone who saw through my strategy before I'd even fully deployed it. Our eyes met across the boardroom table, and for the briefest moment, something unfamiliar flickered inside me. I dismissed it immediately as strategic recognition, one predator acknowledging another. How could I have known it was the first crack in the foundation? The first time Sarah and I met alone was in the Morrison Group headquarters. I'd requested a private tour, standard procedure before dismantling a company. Know the terrain before you reshape it? She insisted on being my guide instead of some mid-level executive. I remember thinking it was a naive attempt to humanize their business, to make me see faces instead of figures. Amateurs often tried this tactic. It never worked. This building was constructed in 1957, she said as we walked through the marble lobby. My grandfather laid the cornerstone himself. I noticed she wore practical heels, not trying to impress, not uncomfortable, confident. Charming, I replied, already calculating the real estate value and development potential. But nostalgia isn't listed on any balance sheet I've ever seen. Instead of the wounded look I expected, she laughed, a genuine sound that echoed slightly in the cavernous space. You know, Mr. Reed, most people at least pretend to care about the history for a few minutes longer. I'm not most people. I check my watch, and time is a non-renewable resource. Fair enough. Then let me show you something that might actually interest you. She led me past the executive offices to a section of the building I hadn't seen in the blueprints. a research division working on energy storage technology. As she explained the technical details, I realized with growing irritation that I was actually interested, not just in the business implications, which were significant, but in the way her eyes lit up when discussing potential applications, the way her hands moved precisely when explaining the technical challenges. This division isn't mentioned in any of your public disclosures, I said, already recalculating valuations in my head. Of course not. It's our ace. If you're going to carve us up, you should at least know what you're really buying. She held my gaze with a directness few people manage. Unless you're only interested in quick profits rather than actual innovation. It was a challenge, plain and simple, and something I rarely experienced, someone seeing through my strategy and countering it without emotion, clouding their judgment. For the first time in years, I felt the rush of meeting an equal. Our meetings became more frequent over the next few weeks. What began as due diligence evolved into lengthy discussions about market trends, competitive landscapes, and the future of various industries. I told myself it was thorough research, nothing more. But I found myself lingering longer than necessary, asking questions that weren't strictly relevant to the acquisition. You don't have to take apart something to extract its value, she said one evening as we reviewed financial projections in the conference room. Outside, the city lights had come on hours ago. Neither of us had noticed. Sometimes that's exactly what you have to do, I countered. Sentiment preserves inefficiency, and demolition destroys potential. She pushed a folder across the table. These are projections for the energy division if it receives proper investment rather than being sold off. The long-term returns dwarf your current plans. I studied the numbers, searching for the manipulation. The emotional plea disguised as strategy. I couldn't find it. The analysis was sound. Better than sound. It was brilliant. Why are you showing me this? I asked. I'm still planning to acquire your company. Because contrary to what you might think, this isn't personal for me either. It's about building something meaningful rather than just extracting value. I thought someone with your vision might understand the difference. Something shifted in that moment. A subtle recalibration I couldn't quite name. I dismissed it as professional respect, nothing more. Yet I found myself calling my team that night, instructing them to revise our approach. We're considering a different structure for the Morrison deal, I told them, possibly keeping certain divisions intact. My CFO was confused. That's not our model. We buy, we break up, we sell. Clean and simple. Just run the numbers, I said sharply, ending the call. Later that week, Sarah and I had dinner. A working dinner, I insisted to myself, though we spent less time on spreadsheets and more on conversations that wandered into personal territory. She spoke of the weight of legacy, of being the only Morrison who saw the flaws in the family business model. I found myself telling her about my first failed startup, a story I rarely shared. You're not what I expected, she said as we finished our meal. What did you expect? Someone less human. She smiled slightly. Your reputation suggests you're more algorithm than man. Algorithms are reliable. Humans are messy. I prefer reliability. And yet here you are, considering a deal structure you've never used before, having dinner with the enemy. She raised her glass. Doesn't seem very algorithmic to me. I couldn't sleep that night. I told myself it was just the challenge of a complex deal, the intellectual stimulation of a new business model. But somewhere in the dark hours, a thought surfaced that I couldn't quite suppress. What if this wasn't just about business anymore? The realization was uncomfortable, foreign, a warning signal my system wasn't designed to process. I'd built my empire on the principle that emotions were liabilities. Now, for the first time, I was making decisions I couldn't fully justify on a spreadsheet. Small adjustments to the deal terms that favored preservation over dismantling. Meetings that ran longer than necessary. A growing preoccupation with one particular person's opinion. My assistant noticed it first. You've rescheduled the Beijing trip twice now, she said, her tone carefully neutral. That's unprecedented. The Morrison deal is complex, I replied, not meeting her eyes. It requires more hands-on attention. But we both knew something had changed. The machine was developing a glitch, a small one, barely perceptible, but potentially catastrophic. And rather than fixing it immediately, as I would have done with any other malfunction, I found myself curious about where this particular error might lead. 3 months into the Morrison negotiations, my executive team called an emergency meeting. I knew why before walking into the room. The deal was dragging on too long. The structure had become unnecessarily complex. The projected returns had decreased from our initial targets. All because I kept finding reasons to preserve parts of the company that should have been liquidated according to our standard model. With all due respect, my COO began, sliding a document across the table. This isn't the deal we discussed initially. Our investors are getting nervous. I glanced at the paper, a side-by-side comparison of our original acquisition plan versus the current proposal. The difference in profit margins was substantial. In any other situation, I would have immediately reverted to the original strategy. Instead, I heard myself defending the revisions. The Morrison Energy Division has more long-term potential than we initially calculated. Breaking it up would be short-sighted. My CFO leaned forward. Since when do we care about long-term potential over immediate returns? That's never been our model. He was right, of course. For a decade, I'd preached the gospel of efficiency and immediate value extraction. Sentiment was for fools. Long-term vision was often just an excuse for poor present performance. I'd built an empire on these principles. We're evolving, I said finally, my voice firm enough to end the discussion. But walking back to my office, I felt the first real tremors of doubt. Was I evolving the business model, or was something else happening? Something far more dangerous to everything I'd built. That night, alone in my penthouse, I forced myself to confront the question I'd been avoiding. What was Sarah Morrison becoming to me? A business associate? A worthy adversary? Or something else entirely? Something that threatened the carefully constructed walls around my emotions? I pulled up the Morrison file on my laptop, determined to view the deal with cold objectivity. The numbers didn't lie. Our revised approach would yield lower immediate returns. The preservation of certain divisions introduced variables that couldn't be fully calculated. From a purely financial perspective, I was making a mistake. Yet I couldn't bring myself to change course. Every time I considered reverting to our original plan, the clean, efficient dismantling of the Morrison Group, I would see her face, hear her voice explaining the history of the company, the potential of their research, the lives connected to each division. It wasn't just sentiment clouding my judgment. It was something more fundamental, a shift in how I measured value itself. My phone rang at midnight. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "The board just called an emergency session," she said without preamble. "My cousins are pushing to accept a competing offer from Westridge Capital. They're promising to keep the company intact, but it's a lie. They'll strip it faster than even you plan to." I sat up, suddenly alert. Westridge doesn't have the capital for an acquisition of this size. They've secured backing from Lambert Partners. My mind raced through the implications. Lambert was notorious for aggressive post-acquisition cost-cutting. Thousands of Morrison employees would lose their jobs within weeks. "Give me 24 hours, I said. "Don't let them vote yet." "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice softening. "Isn't this what you wanted? For us to sell?" The question hung between us, demanding an answer I wasn't ready to give. "Just trust me," I said finally. 24 hours. I spent the night rebuilding our offer from the ground up. By dawn, I had constructed a proposal that preserved the core of Morrison while still delivering acceptable returns to my investors. It wasn't the deal I had initially wanted. It wasn't even the kind of deal I would have considered 6 months ago. But it was the only option I could live with now. My team was stunned when I presented it the next morning. "This isn't who we are," my COO objected. "We're not white knights. We're not in the business of saving companies. We're in the business of creating value," I countered. "And I've determined this is the best way to do that with Morrison." "This is about her, isn't it?" My CFO's question silenced the room. "Sarah Morrison, you've never let a personal relationship influence a business decision before." "This isn't personal," I insisted, even as I recognized the lie. "It's strategic." But later that day, as I presented the revised offer to the Morrison board, as I watched Sarah's carefully neutral expression give way to momentary surprise when she realized what I was proposing, I couldn't maintain the pretense even to myself. Something had fundamentally changed in how I approached this deal, this company, and by extension, my entire business philosophy. The board voted to accept our offer over Westridge's. The Morrison Group would survive largely intact, though under new ownership. By every traditional measure, I had won. Yet as congratulations poured in, I felt strangely unsettled. I had compromised my principles, the very approach that had built my empire, for reasons I still couldn't fully acknowledge. That evening, Sarah found me in my office, staring out at the city skyline. "Why did you do it?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "Your final offer preserved more of the company than necessary. You could have pushed harder. The board was desperate." I didn't turn from the window. "Maybe I'm tired of tearing things down." "I don't believe that." She moved beside me, her reflection appearing in the glass. "The man who built what you've built doesn't suddenly change course without reason." The silence between us grew heavy with unspoken words. The truth hovered dangerously close to the surface. That somehow, without planning it, without even recognizing it happening, I had allowed someone to matter to me beyond their utility. I had made a business decision not because it maximized profit, but because it preserved something important to her. "What happens now?" I asked, finally turning to face her. "Now we implement the transition plan. You become the majority owner of Morrison Group. I stay on as head of operations. We see if your new approach to acquisition actually works." All perfectly reasonable, perfectly professional. But we both recognized that something else entirely was being negotiated in that moment. Something neither of us had anticipated when this all began. "And if it doesn't work?" I asked. Her eyes met mine, unwavering. "Then we'll have made an interesting mistake together." As she left my office, I realized with startling clarity that I had crossed a line I had drawn for myself years ago. The wall between business and personal had begun to crumble. The system that had protected me from vulnerability, from disappointment, from the messiness of human connection, was failing. And the most terrifying part? I wasn't sure I wanted to repair it. The acquisition was finalized on a Tuesday. By Friday, my world began to unravel. It started with an email from my head of security. A routine sweep had flagged unusual access patterns in our company servers. Someone had been extracting confidential data about our other holdings, our acquisition strategies, our client lists, information that would be invaluable to competitors. The access point? A terminal in the Morrison Executive Suite. I stared at the report for a full minute, a cold sensation spreading through my chest. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The acquisition closes and suddenly our systems are compromised. My first instinct, the instinct that had protected me for years, screamed that I'd been played. That the entire Morrison deal, the careful dance of negotiations, the apparent connection with Sarah, had it all been an elaborate con? "Pull the access logs," I instructed my security team. "I want to know exactly who accessed what, when, and from where." My COO's voice echoed in my head. "This is about her, isn't it?" Had he seen something I was too blind to notice? The thought that I might have compromised not just my principles, but my entire company because of, what? Attraction? Emotional manipulation? It was almost too humiliating to consider. I canceled my meetings and locked myself in my office, reviewing every interaction with Sarah through a new lens of suspicion. Our first meeting, had she deliberately shown me the energy division to distract me from scrutinizing other parts of the company? Our late-night discussions, were they calculated to build false intimacy? The emergency board meeting with the competing offer, had it been fabricated to pressure me into a hasty decision? The security report arrived that evening. The data breaches originated from the executive floor at Morrison, but the access codes used belonged to Sarah's cousin, James Morrison, the family member who had most vocally opposed our acquisition. My relief was immediate, but short-lived. If not Sarah directly, then someone in her inner circle. Someone she must have known. Someone she might have been working with. I called her office. No answer. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail. The knot in my stomach tightened. I hadn't felt this particular sensation in years, not since my father's business collapsed and my childhood's security vanished overnight. It was the feeling of betrayal. My driver took me to the Morrison building. The security guard's eyes widened when I stormed through the lobby at 9 p.m. But he knew better than to stop the new owner of the company. The executive floor was mostly dark, but a light shone under Sarah's office door. I pushed it open without knocking. She was hunched over her computer, surrounded by stacks of files. She looked up, startled, then confused by my expression. "Your cousin James," I said without preamble. "He's been accessing restricted data from our systems since the acquisition closed." Her face registered genuine shock. "That's impossible. James left for London yesterday." "Someone used his credentials. Files were copied, strategic information about every company in my portfolio." She stood slowly. "And you think I'm involved?" It wasn't a question. The hurt in her eyes should have diffused my suspicion, but I'd been on guard for too long to trust easily. "The timing is convenient. I make an uncharacteristically lenient acquisition deal, and immediately afterward, my company's security is compromised." "So that's it? After everything, the negotiations, the conversations, the trust we've built, you immediately assume I've betrayed you?" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the edge of pain beneath the control. "Trust is a luxury I've never afforded myself," I replied coldly. "People act in their self-interest. Always. Including you?" She moved around the desk to face me directly. "Was your revised offer just self-interest too? Preserving Morrison divisions that any rational analysis would have liquidated?" The question hit too close to the vulnerability I'd been avoiding. "This isn't about me," I deflected. "It's about data theft that originated from this building, using credentials from your family member." "Then let's find out who's really responsible." She turned back to her computer. "James may have left his credentials behind, but our security system tracks physical access. If someone used his login, we'll see who was actually at his terminal." I watched as she pulled up the security logs. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted there to be an explanation that didn't shatter the fragile connection we'd formed. But the part that had survived, that had built my empire on suspicion and calculated distance, held firm against hope. "There," she said, pointing to the screen. "James's office was accessed at 6:42 this morning by—" She paused, her expression darkening. "By Victor Harmon." The name meant nothing to me. "Who is he?" "Head of our legal department, and my cousin's closest ally on the board." She looked up at me, her eyes clear and direct. "The one who pushed hardest for the Westridge offer." She pulled up an email on her screen. "3 days ago, Victor received this from Westridge Capital." She turned the monitor toward me. The message was brief but explicit, a promise of a senior position at Westridge if he could provide certain strategic intelligence after the acquisition. "They lost the bidding war," she said quietly, "so they decided to steal what they couldn't buy." Relief and shame washed through me in equal measure. Relief that she hadn't betrayed me. Shame that I'd so quickly reverted to suspicion. But old habits die hard. "You found this awfully quickly," I noted, still not fully surrendering my doubt. "Because I've been gathering evidence since yesterday," she replied, pulling out a file. "Victor approached me after the acquisition closed, suggesting we could protect ourselves against you by securing certain leverage. When I refused, he implied he had other ways to proceed." She hadn't just been innocent. She'd been actively working to protect my interests. While I was constructing elaborate scenarios of betrayal, she had been proving herself trustworthy in the most meaningful way possible. The realization hit me with unexpected force. For years, I had operated on the assumption that everyone would eventually disappoint me if given the opportunity. It was the foundation of my business philosophy, the justification for my emotional isolation. Now faced with evidence that challenged this core belief, I felt profoundly disoriented. "I should have trusted you," I admitted, the words foreign on my tongue. "Yes, you should have." There was no triumph in her voice, only a quiet certainty. "The question is whether you're capable of trust at all. Real trust, not just calculated risk assessment." The question hung between us like a challenge. My entire system, the mental framework that had built my empire, classified trust as weakness, vulnerability as failure. Yet standing there, I could no longer deny that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The machine I had so carefully constructed was breaking down, and in its place was something messier, less predictable, but somehow more alive. "I don't know," I answered honestly. But I want to find out. She studied my face for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of my words. Then she nodded once. Then let's start by dealing with Victor together. As partners. Partners. The word resonated in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not adversaries, not merely business associates, but something with the potential for genuine alliance, for trust. As we began formulating our response to the betrayal, I realized the true irony of the situation. I had spent my entire career seeing people as potential threats, guarding against the inevitable moment they would disappoint me. Now, when an actual betrayal had occurred, it had brought me closer to someone rather than driving me further into isolation. My heart, the calculating, efficient organ I had programmed for years to prioritize strategy over feeling, had indeed betrayed me. But not in the way I feared. It had betrayed my carefully constructed system of distance and suspicion, opening up possibilities I had deliberately closed off long ago. And facing those possibilities was the most terrifying and exhilarating feeling I had experienced in years. We moved against Victor with surgical precision. Rather than exposing him immediately, Sarah suggested we feed him carefully selected misinformation, data that would appear valuable but would ultimately lead Westridge into a disastrous business decision. I had to admit, there was a certain poetic justice to it, and her strategy was flawlessly ruthless in a way that, ironically, reminded me of myself. You would have made an excellent corporate raider, I told her as we finalized our plan in my office at midnight. She smiled wryly. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Coming from me? Absolutely. For 2 weeks, we worked side by side, monitoring Victor's activities, tracking exactly what information he was stealing and where it was going. I watched Sarah operate with a combination of integrity and strategic brilliance that challenged my long-held belief that the two were mutually exclusive. She was protective of her employees but clear-eyed about necessary changes, loyal to her family's legacy but uncompromising about modernization. When we finally had enough evidence, we called a joint meeting of both executive teams. Victor arrived looking confident, unaware that his schemes had been discovered. I'll never forget his face as the evidence appeared slide by slide on the boardroom screen. The unauthorized access logs, the communications with Westridge, the offshore account where his payment had been deposited. You're fired effective immediately, I stated flatly when the presentation ended. And if any company in any industry ever considers hiring you for a position requiring more responsibility than watering office plants, they'll receive a complete record of your activities here. As security escorted him out, a strange sensation settled over me. Not the cold satisfaction of eliminating a threat, but something more complicated. The betrayal had been real, but it hadn't come from where I expected, and facing it hadn't required me to retreat further into isolation. Instead, it had become an opportunity for genuine partnership. Later that evening, Sarah and I stood on the rooftop terrace of the Morrison building. The crisis had been averted. The information breach had been contained. Yet something still felt unresolved between us. What happens now, she asked, echoing my question from weeks earlier. I looked out at the city lights, considering my answer carefully. Now we rebuild what was damaged, strengthen what works, let go of what doesn't. Are we still talking about the company? The directness of her question made me smile. Sarah never circled around difficult subjects, another quality I had come to admire. Maybe I'm talking about more than that. She turned to face me fully. You know, when we first met, I thought you were exactly what your reputation suggested. Brilliant but cold. A human algorithm optimized for profit at any cost. Wasn't I? For a while, yes, but then something changed. Her eyes held mine steadily. You made decisions no algorithm would make. You protected things an equation would have discarded as inefficient. She was right, of course. Something had changed. I had changed. The system I had built and maintained so carefully for years had been quietly transforming since the day we met. The walls designed to keep weakness out had started keeping life out as well. And somewhere along the way, I had realized the cost was too high. I've spent my career believing that emotions were liabilities, I admitted, that connections were vulnerabilities competitors could exploit. Victor proved that can be true. He did, she agreed. But he also proved something else, that having someone you trust by your side is more valuable than facing threats alone. The truth of her words resonated deeply. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what had been happening. I had begun to care about someone beyond their utility to me. I had made decisions based not just on profit margins, but on protecting someone important to me. My heart, so carefully regulated for so long, had indeed betrayed my system. And the result wasn't catastrophe, but something closer to liberation. I don't know how to do this, I confessed. My business model doesn't include genuine partnerships. Then maybe it's time for a new model. Her hand found mine in the darkness. One that values more than just the bottom line. 6 months later, the Morrison Group had transformed. Rather than dismantling it for parts as I had originally planned, we had restructured it into something stronger, more innovative, and yes, more profitable. The energy division Sarah had shown me on our first tour was now the fastest growing segment of my entire portfolio. The employees who would have been casualties of my old acquisition strategy were now driving value I hadn't anticipated. My executive team had adapted to the new approach with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some resigned, uncomfortable with a business model that considered factors beyond immediate profit. Others embraced the change, finding renewed purpose in building rather than just extracting value. As for Sarah and me, the partnership that began in crisis evolved into something neither of us had expected. We remained formidable in the boardroom, her vision complementing my strategic thinking in ways that consistently surprised our competitors. But beyond business, we had discovered something I had convinced myself was impossible, a connection that made me stronger rather than more vulnerable. One evening, as we reviewed quarterly projections in my penthouse, she looked up from her tablet with an expression I had come to recognize, the one that meant she was about to challenge my thinking. "You know what I realized today?" she asked. "It's been exactly 1 year since you first walked into Morrison headquarters planning to tear it all down." I set down my glass. And instead, I found something worth building up. No regrets? Your profit margins on this acquisition are lower than your historical average, but the growth potential is exponentially higher. I moved to sit beside her on the couch. Sometimes the most valuable things aren't captured on a spreadsheet. She raised an eyebrow. "Who are you, and what have you done with the ruthless billionaire I met a year ago?" I laughed, a genuine sound that would have been foreign to me before her. He discovered his perfect system had a fatal flaw, which was, it optimized for wealth accumulation while eliminating everything that made wealth meaningful. I took her hand, still somewhat amazed that such gestures now felt natural. The ultimate inefficiency. The empire I had built still stood, still grew, still commanded respect in the business world, but its foundation had shifted from extraction to creation, from isolation to connection. I had feared that allowing emotion into my decision-making would weaken my position. Instead, it had revealed opportunities my calculating mind had been blind to. My heart had indeed betrayed the machine I had built, and in doing so, it had saved me from the perfect, empty success I had been pursuing for so long. Sometimes I still stand on my penthouse balcony, looking down at the city that once felt like my chessboard. But now I no longer see the people below as pieces to be moved and sacrificed according to strategy. I see the complex web of connections that give the game meaning in the first place, and I no longer stand there alone. Looking back now, I can trace the exact moment everything changed. It wasn't when I signed the Morrison acquisition papers. It wasn't even when we exposed Victor's betrayal. It was that first meeting in the boardroom, when I looked across the table and saw someone who refused to be reduced to a number on my spreadsheet. Someone who challenged not just my business strategy, but the entire philosophy that had built my empire. My billions had bought me power, influence, and a certain kind of respect. But they had never bought me the one thing I didn't realize I was missing: genuine connection. I had constructed the perfect fortress to protect myself from disappointment, from vulnerability, from the messiness of human emotion. And in doing so, I had locked myself in a prison of my own making. The greatest irony? I had spent years believing that emotions were inefficiencies, bugs in the human system that needed to be eliminated for optimal performance. I had programmed myself to function like the perfect machine, calculating risk and reward with cold precision. But that approach had a fundamental flaw I couldn't see until it was almost too late. The human heart isn't a liability. It's the most valuable asset we have. My relationship with Sarah taught me that trust isn't weakness, it's courage. Vulnerability isn't failure, it's strength. And success measured only in dollars is no success at all. These days, my company operates differently. We still pursue profit, I haven't become a charity, but we measure value in ways my former self would have dismissed as sentimental. We build rather than extract. We invest in potential rather than strip assets. And the remarkable thing, we're more successful than ever, by every metric that matters. As for my personal life, the man who once scheduled strategic dating as quarterly events now makes time every day for what truly matters. The walls I built so carefully have come down brick by brick, replaced by connections that make me stronger rather than more vulnerable. I still remember something Sarah said to me during our first dinner together. The problem with seeing people as chess pieces is that eventually you forget how to see them as people at all. She was right, and learning to see people again, truly see them, has been the most profound transformation of my life. So if you're watching this and recognize yourself in my story, if you've built walls so high that nothing can hurt you, but nothing can reach you either, know that there's another way. It's messier, riskier, and infinitely more complicated than cold calculation. But it's also the only path to the kind of success that actually feels like winning.